Welcome everybody. Good afternoon. It's still sunny in London, which is great. Great of everyone to be in attendance today. Today we'll be doing a session with David Crow, who's also the inclusion officer here at BCS Agile Special Interest Group. And the talk will be on what is agility? Interesting question, and I'm sure David will share a lot of valuable insights. So let's so one quick question there. Yes, the recording will be made available after the session, most likely on the BCS Agile SG group site. Okay, all right. So let's begin. Over to you, David. Please everyone give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Ahmad, and thank you everybody for being insane enough to turn up to listen to me. This evening, I want to take you on a journey through agility. I'm perhaps going to take some paths you wouldn't take. There might well be some unexpected characters we meet on the way, and I hope that by the end of it, you'll see the familiar a little bit differently. I know I mentioned fun and romp in the sales pitch, but I might have overstated that, so apologies in advance. This is me. I'm a Scrum Master and Agile coach at Gallagher. I've been a CSM for like 20 odd years now. And I have pushed for agility in a number of organizations, in some more successfully than others. I'm also a sessional academic at Christ Church Business School in Canterbury, and I mostly teach the second year undergrad project management course, although I've been asked to do research methods next year, which frankly is terrifying. And I have an education, but the important thing is I'm doing PhD research into narratives in organizational agility. And that's sort of where this talk has come from. Any mistakes that I make this evening are my own, not my employer's, and they're my opinions, not my employer's opinion as well. Although if the employer happens to agree with me, then I'm very happy with that. I love stories. I worked in a library, and I'm interested in what the stories are trying to do, how the stories are reinforcing or changing norms, and what the people who are telling them are trying to do. I want to make the world better for people. I want to make work better for people because that has a wide reach. And it's also why I enjoy teaching. I'm also very, very good overthinking. And if you don't have that by the end of the 45 minutes, you have fallen asleep. This is a work in progress. It's basic research thinking for a thesis chapter, which needs to be fleshed out a bit. You are the first people to see and hear it. The thinking may be incomplete. You may disagree with me. Fantastic. Tell me why. I want to hear about that. You may know that I'm wrong about things. Fantastic. Tell me, because it means I've missed something. If I ask, does that make sense? It means that I think I'm incoherent, not because I think you're incapable of understanding me. So please give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, either way. And if I've descended into waffle, let me know. I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story about a little thing some of us call agile and some of us call agility. But whatever it is, it keeps us busy. Over the next 45 or so minutes, I've got one slide on my master's research project, 3 slides of history of agility. And I'm bound to have left out your favorite ancestor of agility, so do drop them into chat. And I'm going to look at agility as a crystal. Different faces reflect light in different ways and reflect different colors. And then I'll wrap up with a so what. So that's the plan. Let's get started. But first, type into the chat window what you think agility is. So what is agility? There's no right or wrong answers here, as you will tell in a few minutes. Nice. So that's a classic sustainably reducing lead time to business impact. I would argue that's quite a lean definition there. No fixed pathway. That's a nice definition, Fred. I think you'll like some of what I've got to say. P, ability to change, react to outside stimuli. I have to agree with that one for contractual reasons. Adjust quickly. Yep. Agree with that. Incremental delivery, like that as well. Reducing waste. Ability to pivot. I like the word pivot. It sounds more like somebody doing it in a rage when they're really angry and they just sort of pivot on their heel and march out. Improved collaboration. I like that. Yeah, what Tom said it is in 1976. Did you use the word agile in 1976, Tom?
No, I didn't.
See, that's the thing. You were ahead of your time.
Yeah.
Key idea, feedback and change. Yeah, continuous learning. Yeah, I agree with all of this. There's nobody, I mean, it would have been weird if I'd disagreed with anything that people had said here, right? Agility is a whole bunch of all of these things, and yet no two of you wrote basically the same thing. So all I'm saying here is, look, you know, agility is actually more complex than this one thing that we all know what we're talking about. It's trying to do lots of different things, and that's the journey I'd like to take us on. So let's kick off with that. This is the research I did a couple of years ago. In fact, I finished this research, I submitted this research on the 13th of February 2020, and then spent the first 3-4 months of lockdown waiting to find out whether I'd passed it or not. And trust me, that was the worst 3-4 months for multiple reasons. But I did pass, did quite well actually. And what I was interested in was understanding how people talk about agility in what they were writing in public. So I examined a corpus of about 50 pieces of writing to explore what the authors were trying to do with it. I identified 5 core themes: corruption of Agile. So that's the idea that agility isn't what the co-authors originally meant, co-authors of the manifesto. And that was most commonly spoken about by the manifesto co-authors, shockingly, but it was also talked about quite a lot by Agile practitioners. Another theme that came out of the writing was the idea that Agile was historically inevitable. It's the next logical step in management thinking, people said. And this is quite a popular topic, you will not be shocked to learn, with management consultants who are seeking to legitimize the product they're selling, right? This is quite a common rhetoric for consultancy. Then there's insufficiency of Agile. It is, as we all know, it's a starting place. Agile is not complete. And that was a really common theme amongst academic authors, the manifesto co-authors, and corporate authors. Nearly everybody talked about the locus of control changing. So consultants were the big talkers about this, which actually surprised me, but also obviously manifesto co-authors, practitioners and academics all talked about this. It's about that power shift in relationships when you move the power away from the people at the top towards the people at the bottom. And finally, there was a theme of organizational agility. This is about expanding agility outside of software development. Now, I would argue that perhaps this is less of a thing than we think about, but at the time, I still think that's a key topic, and I'll come back to it later. Consultants really are an interesting combination. They're seeking to legitimize their services, talk about issues perceived as being core to agility, and they are talking about achieving different things. So when people talk about agility, they're talking about achieving different things. But where does agility come from? Let's have a quick look at the history. It's just 3 slides. You can cope with that much history. So I thought I'd start in 1776 with Adam Smith, because who doesn't like reading On the Wealth of Nations? And he wrote about the economic benefits of the division of labor. And that's, as you all know, that's the idea that I don't have to write a website every time I want to buy a sandwich. I can just use coins to swap it, and then we each gain coins by the work that we do effectively. About 50 years later, along comes Babbage, and he says, hey, look, these new fancy machines in factories are pretty good. I reckon we can profit off of these. And he writes about the economics of machine. 100 years or so later, we get Frederick W. Taylor. Now, he was a well-to-do kid who didn't do so well at school, and he went to work in a pig iron factory. But because he was well-to-do, he realized that he could boss people around, but if he did it using science, he would do better at it. So he introduced the idea that management was something that we could measure, that would have evidence, has theories, have outcomes. 20 or so years later, Walter Stewart he's a statistician, and he creates what is now known as the Plan, Do, Check, Act loop, PDCA. And Deming took that with him to Japan in 1950, along with statistical process control, and fed hungry Japanese managers who were seeking to reverse the post-war recession. Of course, Deming taught Taiichi Ono, who started in 1940 on the Toyota production system. That was eventually published in 1988. The twin pillars of the Toyota production system are just-in-time production and automation, that's machines with the human touch. Key concepts that come out of Taiichi's work include flow and pull and Kanban, although Kanban is probably not the thing that you think it is. Then I thought it's probably worth looking at organizational psychology as well, right? Because teams are kind of important to agility. So organizational psychology starts in 1933, when Mayo, who got a decent degree in Australia, arrives at Harvard and gets appointed to be a professor of psychology, despite having just having a bachelor's in the subject. He decides that he thinks factories aren't productive because the working classes have psychopathologies, and he needs to fix the workers, sort of applying a bit of Freudian theory here. And although that's perhaps not the approach we would take today, it is the first time applied psychology to the workplace. A few years later, along comes Maslow, and he's like, let's meet employees' needs. Again, that's something that we talk about on a daily basis as Agile coaches, but it's something that's still distressingly novel in a lot of companies. Shine and Bennis in 1967 wrote a paper in which they named psychological safety as a key to effective teamwork. But that idea then effectively got ignored for about 25 years until 1990, when Kahn wrote a paper which brought it back into the mainstream. And that's sort of enough to set us up for a slide about agility. Now, Tom can't see this, which is good, because otherwise he'll get overexcited. But there he is, right at the top. Now, I'm saying the earliest paper that I could find Tom writing about was 1981. I am willing to concede, Tom, you have written about it earlier than that, but I think within 5 years was not a bad estimate. He was experimenting with small batch incremental development. The first thing that I found was published in 1981. The first paper was 1985. And of course, Tom has been a prolific author since. And I have got several, I'm sure it's gigabytes of hard drive space set aside for his writing now. It's clearly agility, even though I think even back then he was using the evolutionary label. We get Takeuchi and Nanaka, who in 1986 wrote a paper called The New Product Game, published in Harvard Business Review. In their paper, they identified that if you pass a piece of work between members of a team, it's substantially more efficient and higher quality than when work is passed between specialist teams to achieve the same goal. And they referred to this as being similar to rugby, when to pass the ball up the pitch, you have to pass the ball between members of the team. Nanaka and Takeuchi directly inspire Sutherland and Schwaber, who in the early 90s were doing what I can only describe as Scrum experiments. And they published their ideas in 1995 at the UPSLA conference. And then again, they joined together back in 2009 to create the Scrum Guide, which is available for free on the internet. Now, Scrum is arguably the most commonly used Agile method. There's lots of reasons for this, but I think one of them is because they were the group that published first, were most visible. It was publicly published, unlike the SDM, which privately published. And so I think that's a really core part of why Scrum is so popular. Then in 2004, we have David Anderson started working at Microsoft, and in 2010, he published Kanban. Now, I think that's a little bit controversial. I have seen some of the other stuff on that. I need to work more detail in there. But I would also argue that Kanban is the most democratically developed of the Agile methodologies we've seen so far. I mean, we've got contribution from people like Mike Burrows, Klaus Leopold, Dan Vacanti, and so on and so forth. And I think that the way that has come together is probably the most democratic of the approaches we've seen so far. I forgot to mention Nagel and Dove. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. XP, thank you for that, Darren. XP definitely should be on this list. And it was originally in my notes, and then I realized I hadn't included it in the graphics, and I didn't have time to redo the graphic. So thank you for picking up on that. I did have stuff on them, but it absolutely should be there. But we're talking about just a little bit later than Sutherland and Schwaber XP started being written about, and they published again just a little bit later than them. So really you're offset by about 5 years, if I recall correctly. I mentioned Nagel and Dove. They published in 1991 the Iacocca report. Now, I'm sure that all of you are fascinated by that report and have read it from cover to cover. Yeah, no, I didn't think so. It basically took the idea of data-driven connected enterprises to achieve small batch manufacturing. It's effectively lean, instead of focusing on waste, to focusing on data in order to achieve the ability to be profitable in small batches. They called that agile manufacturing in 1991. And it is 100% sure that I think it was Mike Beadle that said this is definitely what inspired him to suggest calling it agile at Snowbird. Wait, what's that? Snowbird? How's that not on the list? Look, the problem with Snowbird is that for a lot of people, this is when agility started. Particularly if you speak to inexperienced agilists, like it all starts with the Agile Manifesto. And I hope I've made clear that really it's a development and coming together of ideas from lots of people over a long period of time, not all of whom get the credit they deserve. But agility isn't just the history of ideas coming together, and it's not just the manifesto. So let's look at some aspects of agility. We know it's not something new, it's not something shiny, but it's a set of time-tested ideas which have been added to and developed over time. I'm going to outline some facets of agility and see if they can answer what agility is. I promise it's not gin. So, agility is a set of values and principles. We were taught this very quickly by the manifesto. Manifesto are like, here's the 4 bias values, you know, individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, etc. And then they wrote 12 additional principles. I do not have room for 12 principles on this slide. Just imagine that they're there. I'm sure you will know them off by heart anyway. Then we have Scrum. Scrum has 5 single word values, as do XP. Just proof there for you, Darren, that I was thinking of XP, by the way, just in case that was in doubt. Later on, we get DSDM. It's a bit wordier, frankly, but it's still a clear set of values. Kanban's got 9 values. If you put all of those together, you know, I think there's only one that really is echoed in across them, and that's respect, by the way, in Scrum, XP, and Kanban. The rest, some interesting mixes. But so much has been written about values. I'm not going to say anything new about them today, but it's not what agility is. It doesn't describe in any way how to achieve any of these values. It merely states that these are things that we should consider important and valuable. So let's use the prism of knowledge, practices, and culture. Agility as a body of knowledge is those facts, theories, and models which can potentially be used to know, recognize, and understand phenomena. It's the things that we as practitioners use when we're looking at a problem. We're like, aha, I recognize this problem. I've seen it somewhere before. I'm going to use this approach to solve it. Facts, theories, and models are often locked up in practices and never acknowledged or spoken about. And sometimes the tip of the iceberg of knowledge is documented. Now, I've shown you a bunch of facts about agility already this evening. Is that enough to call yourself an agilist? No, it's clearly not. I don't think you could go away from what I've said so far and start acting in an agile way. So this is knowledge locked up and at rest. There's also agility as a collection of practices, methods, routines, and processes actively applied to do and deliver products and services. This is methodology as a practice. It's knowledge in practice. Now, again, if we just consider agility to be practices, that's problematic because I think we all know it's possible to have a daily stand-up without the team being in any way, shape or form agile. And then there's agility as a culture. These are the lived values reinforced by collective expectations and achieved through habitual practices. It's not just dry values. It's not a book of facts. It's not mechanistic practices. It's agility as a culture. It's in action. Some might call this a mindset. I probably wouldn't be one of them. So perhaps this is how we should view agility. It's a collection of it's a collection of knowledge, practices, and cultures. It takes along ideas for times to change. Taylor is still taught to this day on MBAs, and Kuhn recognized this problem when he wrote in 1962. Now, to be clear, he was writing about changes in regular science. I'm going to be talking about management science. I think there's no problem applying the theory across them. Normally, your scientists, your management scientists, people like us, practitioners, are doing normal science. We're practicing what we're doing. We're running experiments to throw up ideas or prove or disprove the hypotheses we're working under. As management scientists, let's assume that our theory is, right, if I as a manager think hard and explain my ideas to people and they follow my instructions to the letter, then profit, right? You know, this is classic Tayloristic management, do what I say theory. But eventually you start to notice that there's some variations on this. There's some what we call model drift. The observations don't match up. For example, let's say you go to a company and you find a team that's working independently without external dependencies. If you're married to this big man idea of management science, then your answer to that is, well, this is just an outlier. It's not normal. We should ignore it. It's like an albino crow. Like everybody knows crows are black, right up until you see an albino one. But maybe we can argue that it's just not a normal crow, like me. But then what happens is somebody discovers a firm that always runs as independent teams without external dependencies. And suddenly they're thrown into chaos because they can't explain this away like they did the single team or the white crow. They start throwing the old ideas out the windows. I quite like the idea of scientists actually being in their laboratories, like picking up papers and throwing them out of the window, literally. They're that angry about the collapse of their meta-narrative. They need to generate new ideas. They create new hypotheses and they test them against all of the observations that they've done in the past. Eventually, they come up with a replacement theory and they propose that. It goes out into the literature and this creates a revolution. People start talking about the replacement theory and inevitably it becomes accepted by young practitioners and theorists and the older rebels. Okay, and it's up to you where you place yourself on this scale. I'm not judging. Eventually, that triggers a paradigm shift. Experienced practitioners and theorists, however, still built their careers on do as you're told, big man of science or big man of management theory. And it takes 20 to 40 years for the old guard to disappear. At that point, normal science resumes, right up until somebody makes a new observation which doesn't match with the existing theories. Now, agility is starting to be taught in business schools, but it's still more frequently taught in computer science schools. I myself teach traditional project management ideas, but that's not necessarily a problem. Old ideas are often good enough. You would use Newtonian mechanics to describe a simple lever. You wouldn't use Einsteinian relativity to do that. You might use Einstein to describe gravitational lensing because that's a lot more complex and needs the level of refinement that you get from an advanced theory. And a lot of people are still invested in those older ways of working. So agility is probably sort of in this area in terms of paradigm shift, but it's just going to become one more tool that's used. It's never going to completely displace traditional management techniques, in my opinion. Again, that's a great point to argue with if you've got some observations that disagree with it. There's a reflection of strategic models. So I'm going to do a bit of business school theory now because it's kind of cool, but it's also relevant. So this is a very brief history of strategic models, and I promise I'm going to keep this as short as I can. The early models were static models. They very much assume that the world is unchanging. And if it does change, you need to create a new model in order to account for it. You'll have heard of SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, where strengths and weaknesses describe your internal abilities and opportunities and threats describe the marketplace. You might not have heard of Michael Porter's structural approach. Michael Porter wrote a book called Competitive Strategy in 1980. And in 1985, he wrote a book called Competitive Advantage. It is almost certainly down to those two books that people talk about competitive advantage at all. That was when those words became popular in the management speak. And he said that the ability to succeed is based on your position in the market relative to your competitors. In 1991, Jay Barney published his first paper on the resource-based view. Now, it was based on ideas that were older than that. They go back to 1959. And he views the firm as a bundle of resources and people which are organized into capabilities in order to deliver value. Competitive advantage arises from that as a result of having resources and people to which nobody else has access. So here's an idea. You control all of the world's supplies of diamonds. I'm not thinking of De Beers at all. Imagine it's some other company, right? That means that your competitors can't sell diamonds. That's a barrier to entry. You have competitive advantage probably for a very long period of time because nobody else can duplicate the product or service that you're providing. Now, note when this came out, this is around 1991. That's about the same time that all of the companies changed their personnel departments to be human resource departments. That is not a coincidence. It's the point at which humans started to be seen as resources to organize into value. The resource-based view is still dominant today. It's not very agile, though. Of course, in the 1970s, and I'm sure Tom will argue before that, we had the software crisis. It led a lot of software engineers to realize that complexity means that static approaches are dangerous. That, plus the rise of the internet and the massive social and political changes that took place in the 80s and 90s, made the world a much more complex and faster changing environment. Now, Thies and Peteraf. In 1991, a trio, Thies, Pisano, and Schuon, started circulating a paper called about dynamic capabilities. And then a couple of years later, Margaret Peteraf published a paper on the economics of dynamic capabilities. Again, this is about the time we see agility models emerging. They also see the firm as a bundle of resources and people, but they ask the question, what happens if the environment changes or our access to resources change? What happens if we run out of diamonds? What if people can't afford diamond rings anymore? Or what if Elon Musk finds a stash of diamonds on Mars? So what they described was a bunch of meta capabilities, dynamic capabilities, if you will, that allow the firm to monitor the environment, identify and capture new opportunities, and reconfigure the resources and people. And that is to deliver new products and services or to use different resources to deliver existing products and services. So an example of a dynamic capability in action, very slowly, I would add, is Lego moving towards using plant-based plastics. So their idea is to replace one of their resources or access to resources with a new resource, but effectively nothing else changes. It's still a change though. According to the dynamic capability theory, competitive advantage arises from the ability to sense, create, and seize new opportunities, see off threats, and to reconfigure your resources and people. Dynamic capability very much mirrors the ideas of agility, the firm's ability to change direction rapidly, and that's considered the competitive advantage. Now, until very recently, there are very few links between dynamic capabilities and agility. That's not to say that there weren't obvious parallels, but the people who were interested in dynamic capabilities weren't interested in agility, and the people who are interested in agility weren't interested in dynamic capabilities. Clearly, there's a common cause here, but it's not that agility is the implementation of dynamic capabilities or the other way around. So it's an interesting alignment, but it's not agility. It's useful, but it's not agility. Okay, I've lost a slide. So that's the dynamic approaches emerging. That's what I forgot to click on there. The other thing that emerged in the 1990s was market orientation. Okay, this is again about the same time that we see agility emerging. Market orientation is about the firm looking outward to understand the market instead of inward to understand their products. Now, that sounds like such an obvious statement that I can't believe that only happened in the 1990s, but it was revolutionary at the time. And it's still an ongoing transformation, particularly in the non-profit and public service sectors. Market orientations includes product orientation. So it's a shift from delivering projects to sustainable products and services which are managed and maintained and not just an output for a project which is then shut down. There are, and I would argue that this is in theory, shifts away from short-term profit to sustainability. Market orientation is value oriented. If there's no value, there shouldn't be any investment. Agility is a great key to getting at value. And delivery orientation. So in theory, delivering value as quickly as possible and getting return on investment as quickly as possible, where return on investment can also include learning and understanding and other stuff. There's a shift away from bureaucracy and a change in the locus of power, from the people at the top of the tree to the people doing the work. Is this what agility is? Again, it's a parallel development. We've got agility's emergent and market orientation happening at the same time, but A did not cause B. There's probably some influences there, but again, marketing people aren't interested in what software geeks are doing, and software geeks aren't interested in what marketing people are doing. So again, there's parallels, but they're not causal. I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about some philosophy now. I'll try and keep this as practical as possible. Modernism is characterized by a single narrative managed by authority. It's top down. And if you think about Taylor's and Mayo's approaches to management, then you've got this modernist approach. It's management know best, do what you're told. Who doesn't love a hierarchy? Deleuze and Guattari, who are two of my favorite philosophers, talk about this as being an arborescent structure, the tree. Each part of the tree has a job and a place, but they're rigid, and the tree is woody, so it can't adapt to change. It relies on the hierarchy to maintain stability. Above the ground, you've got the trunk, which turns into branches, which turns into smaller branches, which turns into tiny, tiny branches and leaves. Below the ground, you have the base of the trunk where thick roots divide off into smaller and smaller and smaller roots. But the trunk is identity and the core to the tree's success. If you want to kill a tree, kill the trunk. Traditional projects are like this. There's one version of the truth. One person has control, the project manager. He controls a mono-narrative, one story, how and when to deliver, what they're delivering. It's a single plan and it's that person's plan. It's big bang delivery because no part of this tree makes sense without the rest of the tree. Of course, that means one person gets credit, and on the flip side, there's only one neck to strangle if they get it wrong. Post-modernism emerged in the 1960s and was a reaction to the overwhelming inaccuracies of the narratives of the era. Think about the 1960s, where you start to see the challenging of political, religious, social contracts, and the stories that are being told by the authorities at the time, and arguably still today, are still very much in conflict with the reality that the people are living. Postmodernism is characterized by multiple narratives negotiated and interpreted by many contributors. Bear with me 2 seconds. Postmodernism is adaptive and organic. It's been described as the death of deference. Think about Andy Warhol. It's repetition and difference, all those cans of soup. It's the 15 minutes of fame. What does this look like? Well, let me tell you about Pando. In Utah, in Fish Lake National Forest, is the world's largest organism, named Pando, or the trembling giant. It's about 1 million years old, and above ground is a colony of male quaking aspen trees covering about 108 acres. They are genetically identical, so they're clones of each other effectively. Below ground, you can see that these trees are actually part of a single organism and have a single rhizomatic root system. If you take all of that and sort of shake off the dirt, it's going to weigh around 6,000 metric tons. It is an absolutely huge single organism. Rhizomes are that type of root. Now, you know, if I say ginger, you know what a rhizome is. So ginger is a rhizomatic plant. Rhizomes grow in any direction, seeking out nutrients. They become heavily intertwined. That's why you get those knobbly bits on ginger. And they attach themselves to root plants, to plant root systems in order to suck the nutrients out of them. When they want to, they can stick their heads above ground and become tree-like for a while. Products delivered with agility are exploratory and iterative. Agilists send out little rhizomes to find sources of value and seek rich seams. There's no trunk, so each part has to make its own decisions, delivering value to the whole and engaging early with customers. They can take on arborescent characteristics when they need to, and collectively the team either succeeds or collectively the entire plant dies. And another example of a rhizomatic plant is Japanese knotweed. And if you've had to deal with Japanese knotweed, you'll know how difficult it is to kill that plant off, because you only need about 0.5 centimetre of the rhizome to remain in your soil and it will regrow. So maybe agility is a shift towards the postmodern. Perhaps Tom Gilb is a countercultural icon and hasn't told us about it. Not a big fan of Douglas Adams, but he often makes points in ways that other people can't, so let's run with it. Maybe Agile is just a fad. Now, management fads are defined as a relatively transitory collective belief disseminated by management fashion setters that a management technique leads rational management progress. Okay, that does sound a bit like how I've been describing Agile this evening. Fads are often created by gurus who feed the mass media with their ideas. The mass media feed consultancy firms feed academics, and the academics feed the gurus. And we have a perfect circle where the ideas go round and round and round, and they take on their own lives. The life cycle of a fad looks like somebody starting with rhetoric. Oh, everybody's doing this, you should do it, which actually sounds like the schoolyard, right? Oh, no, everybody's doing heroin, man, it's really cool. Everybody's doing Agile, man, it's super cool, right? So that's the rhetoric. It becomes a really intensive discourse. You'll find everyone's writing about it, everybody's talking about it. And then eventually the firm adopts it. They interpret it to be what they need it to be in their context. They experience some change, and then they experience dissatisfaction. And so they go to look for the next rhetoric. Fads are very cyclic. Believe it or not, there is a massive management literature on fads. So, I mean, obviously there's literature on people writing about the fads and, you know, like buy my fad, but there's also people going, this is what a fad looks like and how to manage it. Is agility a fad? Bad news, Tom, you might be a fad. We have consultants and we have certificates. Maybe those are characteristics of fads. Perhaps a difference of type of agility of fads, not agility itself, but like the different flavors of agility. Are the manifesto co-authors gurus? I do hope one of them's on the call this evening. even if it started as a fad, and even if the authors are gurus, it's clearly bigger than that now. And I don't think that it meets the relatively transitory approach. So I think we can actually say it's probably not a fad, although there may be some faddish qualities about it. Maybe we all want to be gurus. So now let me throw the baby out with the bathwater. Instead of saying, what is agility? Let me say, does agility even exist? Right, I did philosophy a minute ago. We're going to do some metaphysics now, and that's even more fun. I will try and keep it simple, but let me introduce you to these three bad boys: ontology, epistemology, and axiology. Ontology is the things that we believe exist, okay? A modernist ontology is very hierarchical. A small group of people control what exists. So a typical modernist ontology might be the communist argument that these are the things that exist. Postmodernist ontologies tend to be less hierarchical, less structured, and in fact would be described as a flat ontology. If we're talking about it, if we can imagine it, then for all intents and purposes, it exists in the same way as physical objects exist. So what might an agile ontology look like? Well, I think we're safe to say that agile isn't real. Now, I'm using the word real in very, very specific sense here, so please don't scream at me yet. It's not describing the physical universe. We could take everything in the universe, put it inside a really, really big pestle and mortar and grind it down, and we won't find a single atom of agility at all, okay? Even in the sense of a Platonic ideal, it's not great, because it suggests that agility has a perfect form, right? And that is problematic, because if it has a perfect form, we can never achieve it. And perhaps that means that it becomes corruptible. Instead, I would describe agility as an intersubjective social construct. That's basically to say we've created it as a bunch of humans and we talk about it together. It's like currency, right? We all share and use currency daily, but it's only an idea, right? There's no such thing as actual currency. It's not a real thing. It's been reified. That is to say, you know, we have coins that are a physical manifestation of money, of currency, but it's not real in and of itself. And in fact, arguably, agility is reified in the form of the various methods, methodologies, and implementations. And it's inter and intra-organizational. Its meaning changes from firm to firm, from implementation to implementation, and from culture to culture. And I want to stress this: just because something isn't objectively real, just because it's just a social construct and used daily, doesn't mean we should ignore it. Currency is a social construct and we talk about it all the time. Epistemology is, how do we know what we know? What evidence is necessary and sufficient to persuade us that something is true or false? I mentioned Kuhn earlier when I did that big cycle of science. That's epistemology of science. How do scientists know that their ideas are true? The epistemology of agility, well, we've tested Agile repeatedly. Mostly it passes the tests. Sometimes it fails. Now, sometimes our excuse for its failing is, oh, they weren't really doing Agile, right? You know, that's back to this idea that there's an ideal agility. The experiments we've done aren't in a lab. That's largely because looking up 20, 30 employees in a laboratory for, 10 years to find out whether method A works better than method B is generally frowned upon and considered unethical. Instead, we use case studies, bodies of knowledge, practices. And in the community and business sector, there is what might be called a social epistemology that agility delivers value. So we have formal and informal evidence supporting it, and it suggests we can know it. We can know that it's true. Agility also generates localized and non-generalizable truths. That is to say, this particular idea works in this particular place at this particular time, but we can't say, oh, well, that will also work over there. The third guy is axiology. And it's all about values. It's the axioms which underline our ideas of what's important and valuable. Agile values are context appropriate, postmodernist. Thank you for driving past right then, sir. And reject a mono-narrative. They're a collective construction of understanding from a plurality of narratives. Values guide the choice of the agile methods that we make, of which tools we use at different times, how to know if they're working. And all three of these, ontology, epistemology, and axiology, work together. Your values will drive your ontology of epistemology and, of ontology and epistemology. What's true depends on what your values are. And firm values vary. Firm A might value short-term profits, whilst firm B values low profits, but sustainability for the firm and the environment. In which case, perhaps you will choose different agile methods in order to meet those needs. Ontology affects values. If you believe that humans and chickens are in the same class, then you probably won't eat chickens because you see them as equivalent. That changes your axiology. And it will also change your epistemology. What types of evidence are acceptable to you if you believe that certain things exist? And epistemology affects both ontologies and axiologies. What we know to be true influences our values and what we know to exist. So agility isn't even real, but it is real. And so what? So what is agility? It's not objectively real, but everybody here thinks it exists. Or if you don't, please tell me, because I've wasted my time if you already thought it didn't exist. It does influence how we view the world. It does give us evidence when we're making decisions. It braids together ideas from over 250 years of history, bringing together the idea that management should be a form of knowledge, a science, which we can systematically apply to solve problems, incorporating ideas from psychology, sociology, and statistics. We saw how people created small experiments which delivered unexpected results. Tom, Ken, Jeff, etc. And turned into some of the most successful ideas and methods we've seen in the last 30 to 40 years, and they have transformed many workplaces. We've seen that agility is a body of knowledge, a set of practices, and a series of cultures which adapt to different contexts. It's undergoing a paradigm shift, but sometimes you don't need to use agility because you're only delivering something simple. Dynamic capabilities may better represent the world we live in than the resource-based view, but if their industry is relatively unchanging, they don't need dynamics. Agility is probably a postmodern approach to management. It might be a fad or a series of fads. We're all wannabe gurus out for our 15 minutes of fame, and I've got mine tonight, problem solved. So it's exactly what I've described it as tonight. It's a story, and it's a narrative. A story is a classic plot. Boy meets girl from a family of arch enemies, and it doesn't end well. Or young guy discovers magical powers and fights his father. A narrative, on the other hand, is a particular version of a story. If you take the elements of a story and rearrange them, you get a new narrative. So this evening, I've told you a bit about a story about agility. And I've also told you a particular narrative. And if I told it differently, it would be the same story, but I would achieve different goals and objectives. Everyone tells their stories differently, even if it starts from the same basic premise. But you have to choose that narrative that works for you in context. Stories are the most basic human-specific skill we have, and then the most efficient way we have to pass information along to other people. A key part of the job of the agilist is to tell stories. We tell stories to people never previously exposed to Agile to make the ideas accessible, to take the abstract and in some way make it concrete, something that it becomes something that can be used for someone to start their own journey. After all, stories have started every journey we have ever taken. Stories, literal stories, are a great way to engage with novices because they don't have to focus on the details. They can follow the pattern and build their knowledge as they proceed. That reduces anxiety because stories as a structure are so familiar to people. There's even research that ideas are more effectively recalled if told as a story. And even with people with experience, it can be stories that encourage them to move to the next level. Stories create knowledge. They're a key way that we know what we know. Stories are evidence. Depending on what you're trying to do, they might not be great evidence, but nonetheless, they're a key way that people make links between different types of knowledge and link ideas together. Stories also spark imagination about what might be. You might have noticed that a fair amount of the bookshelves behind me are given over to Star Trek if they're not given over to academic research. Star Trek taught me to imagine a better world. It taught me ways of thinking without me even noticing I was being taught. If stories can create entire universes in fiction, then they can do the same in the real world. They're the basis of cultures. They're the core way in which we convey social norms and expectations. And they're also how we start to change existing contexts. They are a core way in which we express our realities to one another. Stories are ontology builders. Just like I've done tonight, agility is a story that has been changing people's realities since the 1960s and is continuing to do so. And if you want to think about how the world can be better, then stories are the way forward. Now, a slight aside, you are not expecting the slide I'm about to put up. Does anybody recognize these characters? Please just put a yes or something in the chat if you do. It'd be nice to know how many people are going to do what happens. Okay, good. Okay, I'm glad you do, Pete. One of my favorite things about being an uncle is reading stories to small children. And my husband, who's a primary school teacher, says it's one of the best things about his job. My favorite book to read to my nephew was Harry McClary from Donaldson's Dairy. Younger children particularly like this type of story when they start to develop anticipation. So here's an example. I'm going to read this to you, not least because I haven't read this for ages. So, Schnitzel von Krumm with a very low tongue, Blitzer Maloney all skinny and bony, Muffin McClay like a bundle of hay, Bottomley Potts all covered in spots, Hercules Morse as big as a horse, and Harry McClary from Donaldson's Dairy. Now, I will almost guarantee that people who are familiar with this story will have said, and Harry McClary from Donaldson's Dairy, because it is reinforced and reinforced and reinforced through this book. And you normally have to read it about 1 million times to children. My nephew Kyron would always remember that last bit because he knew it was coming and he had been excited for it to appear, for that line to turn up right from the start of the page. He just needed the story cues for the next line. Why is that relevant, David? Why are you talking about a kid's book? I mean, it's a great question. And stories create paths. By telling stories, we start to normalize values. Stories tell us acceptable ways to behave and the consequences of behaving in other ways. Stories can challenge existing values and can reinforce the values already embedded in the culture. Stories prompt us how to respond to events. When you see this pattern, this is what we do. A great example of this is the DRAB mnemonic for first aid: danger, response, airway, breathing. The first thing it tells us is a value, danger. If it's dangerous, you get help or make the space safe. We don't want heroes, we want people to survive. Another example is the probably apocryphal story of a man who made the mistake and cost his employer millions of pounds. He went to offer his resignation to his boss, and his boss laughs and said, "No way are you leaving, we've just paid for your education." Those little twists make stories memorable. Story after story after story, using different narratives, create ruts in the mind and start to create paths. When faced with something new, the mind defaults back to connections and paths it already has. We as agilists use those stories to create new ruts and start to build them into motorways. We've told and retold the stories of agility. As agilists, we've internalized those stories. They're as natural a view on the world as money is to us. It's a valuable story which can help people achieve things they never thought they could. It's an inspiring story which creates new opportunities and values in the teams we serve. I started by asking, what is agility? I think agility is awesome. It's an inspiring story which we use to make the world better, to deliver superior products and value, and to improve working environments. What do you think agility is? Do you think it's real? What stories do you tell about agility? Have I given you any new perspectives? Type it in the notes, and you can ask questions at the same time. Thank you. Yes, Tim. Yeah. So I could have used the word meme as well, 100%. Memes are just stories, right?
Absolutely, but I think they're often seen as tongue-in-cheek, so I wouldn't use that word in something like this. But I love the idea of it being an insidious mind virus that we're spreading through stories.
Yeah, that reminds me of some cyberpunk literature, Tim. So, I mean, if you want to see what Tim means by that, there's a great episode of Star Trek, because of course there is, called Darmok, and you should go watch that episode because I don't want to spoil it, but let's just say memes are really important.
I think it's one of those where the walls will fall, mate.
Yes, Shaka.
Okay, excellent session, David. Really well researched.
Thank you, Ahmad. Does anybody have any questions, please?
Okay, if you can post your questions into chat, or you're more than welcome just unmute and just speak to David directly.
Or challenges as well. You know, if I've got something wrong, and like I'm well aware that Tom's sent me some corrections already. Thank you for that, Tom. I'm going to just close this so that I can make sure I capture that feedback from Tom. Thank you for those. Anybody have anything else?
So can I just ask one question, actually?
Please.
Go for it.
You talked about the sharing of stories, and I think being effective and getting people to understand things, storytelling is one of the key skills that I like to use and bring to bear. But are you aware of ways that we can better share amongst us as a community those stories of success? Because I think we've all got our own stories and we've got our own small communities. But is there, not that I'm sure that there could be a body of knowledge. I'm not sure this is a well-formed question, but it's like, how do we get more of those stories, a more diverse set of stories as a body of knowledge for us?
So it is a good question. Do you remember I mentioned Takeuchi and Nanaka earlier in the history slides? Takeuchi and Nanaka wrote a book, which happens to be just here, The Knowledge Creating Company. And this was really the first time that somebody had articulated that knowledge is a resource. This goes back to that resource-based view of the firm. Knowledge is a resource which is locked up in a firm, and it's encoded in the ways in which your firm works. And it's encoded in those rituals and processes and those routines. And very often we encode the rituals and the processes and the routines, and it's often encoded in the bureaucracy, by the way. Like a bureaucracy is just the concretization of what was valuable at the time the bureaucracy was created. What they're saying here is, well, no, most people don't ever document the stories. They are just part of our day-to-day lives. And, you know, you can think of it as being like an iceberg, where you've just got the tip of the iceberg of knowledge is actually documented, and the rest of it's tacit and embedded in the organization. I do think that, what am I thinking here? So what I think is that we do need to reflect better and record those stories, because that's what this ultimately is. It's reflecting on what we're saying and the experiences we're having, and then capturing those in reusable ways. Now, things like this are a great way of doing it, right? Everybody who comes to one of these is telling a story, and it's another example of that embedded knowledge. But is there a central place? No. How much time do you have, Tim?
For you, after this session, all the time in the world, David.
Thanks, Tim. Well, if you could sort out a website, we can maybe start capturing some of those stories.
Yeah, I'll catch up with you offline, mate.
Okay. Anybody else?
Well, I was just thinking that translating stories into kind of business speak, the industry needs more case studies, really. And case studies are essentially stories. Yeah, they do. They do need case studies, yeah.
No, you're right, actually. No.
I think that's one thing that where Agile, you know, when you talk about more stories, case studies would be perfect for that, you know, from different organizations, different sectors, different industries, different levels. You know, we need more stories based on real experiences.
Yeah, so I will point out that my research project is specifically looking at organizational stories. So that's what I'm, when I say narratives of organizational agility, that's literally what I'm interested in. I want to look at those stories and start to find out, what are the things that are common between them, and also what are the things that are violently different between them. I'm interested in what the difference between agility in a non-profit is versus agility in, I don't know, Facebook or Microsoft or, one of the big firms like that. What stories are they telling? What is it they're trying to get out? I think a lot of them will be about value, but I don't know that that's true about non-profits, or if it is, then their concept of what value is going to be different. But you're right, we do need more case. I'm not a big fan of case studies as a research method or as evidence, because they're just stories, right? But provided we accept them as stories, then it's absolutely fine. And this is an argument I'm having with one of my supervisors as well, by the way. My supervisor's like, oh, you really need to justify use of narratives in stories. And I'm like, what do you think case studies are? Like, you've been using these for years, and you're telling me that actually talking about them as stories is shocking. And yes, there is also the problem that case studies outside of academia are often marketing case studies. That's referred to as TIM. Yes, also to Alex, we should definitely tell stories of failure and learning opportunities, not just success. Although if you're learning, then it's not failure. So I don't know how those work together.
Cool. Any more questions, discussion points, ideas anyone wants to discuss? Actually, one thing that popped into my head was, when you're talking about the history of Kanban, I know you didn't elaborate too much on it, but there's this great video by Dan Vacanti, which is the secret history of Kanban and why it matters.
Yeah, that was the video that I sort of alluded to.
Cool. I'll just post that link. So if anyone wants to,
yeah, no, please do, because it's a great story.
It is a great story.
So there's two problems here. Like, obviously, when we talk about Schwaber and we talk about Sutherland and we talk about even Tom, and I assume this is true, Tom, I haven't spoken to you about this, but Tom, Jeff, etc., they're the people that are seen to do the writing after the event. Right? There were other people involved in those projects, and it's very often that sort of gets lost by the side. And what happened with Dan's fantastic video, and I have, like I say, I have watched this particular video in Secret History of Kanban, sort of suggests that what happened with David Anderson was a bit of glory grabbing, and there were other things going on as well. But at the end of the day, he still wrote the first book, and all I can do is credit him for doing that.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, since nobody's asking a question, there's two announcements I needed to make, and I'll get those in now. First one is that we, or the BCS Agile SG, are organizing a conference in September. This is essentially a conference for new speakers, and the theme is essentially going to be introduction to Agile. I will post a link for it. We've actually got call for papers open for this at the moment. So if you want to kind of develop yourself as a speaker, got something to say, more than welcome to propose a talk. CFP closes at the end of the month, and yeah, we'll welcome every submission. Second announcement. Our chief and chair, Saf, is doing a session on Friday. It's a kind of daytime session, and it's a topic that complements this session really well as well. It covers how to get started in agility without any experience. So yeah, if you're free on Friday, more than welcome to join that as well. Okay, that's Friday this week. Cool. Okay, that's me done.
Probably just add that's in collaboration with BCS Women Specialist Group.
Yeah.
Cool.
So thank you very much for your attention, everybody, this evening. I really appreciate your time. I put my LinkedIn thing out there. It's David X Crow. You can find me relatively easily. Please feel free to drop me a message if you want to ask a question not in public. Tom, feel free to spam my inbox with complaints about how wrong I got it all.
Yeah, cool. And once the video is ready, I'll ask Kerry at BCS to mail out everyone who signed up through the Eventbrite, so you have the link as well. Okay. And yeah, thanks again, everyone, for the attendance. Really good turnout.